87 911 wide body cab. Customer complaint on this is AC is not cold, and we have verified that with our temperature gauge. Started the car, ran it with the AC on a medium setting, and no difference between ambient and vent temperatures. So this customer has had some work done on the system. Somebody's already converted it from R12 to R134. So the first thing I've done is see if there's any gas in it. What I see when I hook my gauges up with the engine off is very low system pressure. This typically means that there's no gas in the system. Next step, I'll start it up and see what happens to the pressures. Ideally, what I would see is look to see my high side pressure climb right around between 185 and 225 for R134, and a low side pressure around 25 to 35 psi. Ready? So what you saw is immediately the low side went straight to 0. This is because there is most likely no gas in the system. So the pump's trying to draw that gas into the compressor to compress it and turn it into a liquid. We saw a slight rise in high side. It went from 45 to about 65, but that's just because it's moving air around in the system. So the system has a leak. I have looked underneath it, and even though this is a particularly low mileage car, it still has all the original hoses in them. And back in 87, when this was built, it was designed for R12, and we looked at things a little differently back then. It was normal to add gas and acceptable to have a certain amount of leakage out through the lines. As these hoses have gotten older, this leak has increased. So the only thing I really want to do is check our compressor, and judging by the finish on it, somebody looks like they put a rebuilt unit in. And the reason why I say that is this has been painted versus this is an original aluminum finish. Porsche never painted these originally, so I'll dump a half a pound of gas in there and just take my leak detector and check the front seal, and then I'm going to quote for replacing all the lines in this car. Let it warm up for a minute. So all I'm going to do now is dump about 8 ounces into the system, just enough to get some gas in and circulate, and that way I can scan my compressor for any leaks.
Got a leak right here.
Yeah, there was something in there. There could be an accumulation of gas just from the hose area. And that's the thing, when the hoses are leaking, it's often really hard to find it in the actual line. Is leaking, I'll pick it up in the vent.
Oh.
And it's actually blowing cold.
Yeah.
Although not cold enough.
But it's cold. There.
So I've sucked all my gas back out, and I'm just going to see if I can pull a vacuum on the system. I do get a slight rise in tone on my gas detector right around the back of the compressor. So this is it's an older unit. I've had it for a long time, but it's very accurate. Any increased in the beep rate on this indicates a small seepage. So this could be an ounce to ounce and a half a year leak. When I pull a vacuum, that'll tell me a little bit more, even though I haven't changed all the hoses yet. It'll tell me a little bit more about the compressor, and I can isolate it. If the front seal, which is usually what goes bad on these, very rarely have I seen a major mechanical failure. It does happen, but just not that often. Most times the front seal fails. And just changing a front seal, you can buy the kits for about $70. Experience usually has found that it's not worth the time and effort because they don't tend to last too long. Normally the front seal leaks because of bearing wear, and so you don't usually end up saving anything. It's better to buy a new compressor. One thing I did do is, while I had some actual pressure in the system, we were up to around 180 high side PSI, is I did just go over my condensers. These sometimes will crack a solder joint and cause a leak there. Didn't find any issues there. Rarely will you find a hose leaking with any kind of leak detector unless it's a substantial leak. What happens is the hose actually bleeds out through the membranes, and you'd have to go over every single inch to pinpoint where it's coming from. Usually it's just time to change, put the barrier hoses in it. Also did check around the evaporator. I put my leak detector into the AC vent. If the evaporator was leaking, it'll pick it up in the AC vent. Nothing around the expansion valve. Did get a hit up by the receiver dryer, like there was a leak in that general area with a hose failure. The way that this system works is when it detects a leak, it automatically resets and allows you to zero in on a leak. So if you have a big leak in the area, it'll give you that high-pitched signal. The light pulse will increase and the beeps will increase, and then it'll drop back down to its normal pace. This is so you can fine-tune on that leak. To recalibrate it back, you pull it out of that area, let it suck some fresh air, go on your calibration setting, and reset it that way. So there is definitely something leaking up by the receiver dryer. I feel it's like the hoses, but the major components seem to be okay. So I was able to pull a vacuum fairly quickly, just in the time that I was talking. I don't expect it to stay because I know there is something leaking in there, but if it drops off really quickly, and I'll give it maybe 4 or 5 minutes, if it drops all the way back down to zero, that's usually a good indicator that your compressor's not working too well. And it looks like it's already starting to move. So we're changing the lines on this 87 911 cab. One of the differences from our other AC job that you can watch where we change lines is this car has skirts down the side, which you can see is over on the ground over here. So to get access to your AC lines, this is a later model car. It actually has some much better bracketing. The lines are not just secured directly to the bottom of the vehicle. They got little standoffs, but you do need to pull all of that undercarriage out to gain access. So it takes a little bit longer. So here's our leaking hose that probably set off our leak detector in the receiver dryer area. Okay, so I have all of my hoses changed. I have a new compressor mounted. I've put the system under a vacuum and I've let it sit for pretty much all day. This is just to see if I've got any leaks or any loss of vacuum. Previously, when I did this with the original system, it lost all vacuum in about 20 minutes. We've been under a vacuum now for about 4.5, 5 hours and no loss of vacuum. So I'm ready to charge the system. First thing I want to do, I have a new compressor, and by changing all of the lines, we lose a lot of the refrigerant oil that is in the system. So first thing I'm going to do is charge it with some oil that's charged through the suction side. And then I'm just going to rotate my front compressor clutch here just to cycle it through, so when I first fire it up and start charging it, it's not a huge lump of oil inside the compressor. Okay, so when I charge this, I have opened the vacuums, the low pressure side. I'm just going to open my valve, and I'm going to put about 1.5 ounces of oil in it. There's about 2 ounces actually. And when the system's under a vacuum, it'll just pull that oil right in. Now, I did try to catch as much oil as I could so I could get an idea of how much I was getting out. But the fact that we were changing the lines, most of it ended up on the ground. So it was very hard to capture. And draining the old compressor, I only recovered about 1/4 ounce out of it. So I'm about to charge the system. Right now I've set my machine at 1.5 pounds. I'm just going to open the low side, and then I'm going to kind of watch the gauges and see where we're at. Because we're charging an R12 system with R134, we don't want to put as much R134 in the system as R12, as their operating pressures will be too high. Each car is a little bit different, so I'm going to watch my gauges, look at my suction line cooling, look at my vent temps, so I can get a final charge amount. At 22, then a little fluctuation. High side pressures are good. You can see shutting the lid, it brought the pressure down about 20 psi on the high side. So we're down at around 46-degree vent temp and dropping. Now in the shop, it's not going to be as good as driving because I'm going to have airflow over my front condenser, not just relying on the fan, as well as more fan pulling in on my rear condenser, but the needle is moving down a little bit towards 45 degrees. So far I need to go recheck my pressures, just see what they look like, see if we need to add a little more gas or whether it's looking good. Okay, so with the engine running at around 1500 RPMs, on my gauges I noticed my low side was dropping down to around 10 psi. That's an indication there's not enough gas in the system. So I just added a few more ounces, and my pressure, my high side pressure's climbed a little, still within range, but it kept my low side from going into a vacuum. And right now, positive effect on the temp gauge, we are at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so well and truly into the nice and cold range. So that pretty much wraps it up for this one. We've got a vent temperature right around 40 degrees. Suction line, so feeling suction line, it is freezing cold, which is what we expect it to be. I removed my gauges, put the service caps on, made sure the O-rings are both good in service caps, and we're pretty much ready for put it back on the ground. Quick road test, ready to give it back to its owner.